Welcome to Indie Film Forum. I'm your host, Kalpana Biswas. It's my privilege today to introduce you to screenwriter Marc Nieson. Marc, born in Brooklyn, is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and NYU Film School. He serves on the faculty of Chatham University in Pittsburgh and is fiction editor of The Fourth River. His award-winning feature-length screenplays include Speed of Life, The Dreamcatcher, and Bottomland. Marc's life adventures include children's theater, cattle chores, and a season with a one-ring circus. His memoir, Schoolhouse: Lessons from the Heartland, is forthcoming from Ice Cube Press, and he's at work on a new novel, Houdini's Heirs. I'm delighted to have Marc as my guest today. Marc, it's wonderful to have you here. You had all kinds of interesting adventures. What moved you into screenwriting?
I think as a young child, I was doing visual art more than anything. And then at some point that turned into photography, and then photography turned into filmmaking, and then filmmaking turned into writing. I went to NYU as a student back in the mid-1980s. And what I learned in film school ultimately was that the medium of making movies, the production end of it, didn't sit as well with me. There was a lot of choreography involved, a lot of people to involve, and the funding and the time, and all of those things seemed to be very complex to me. But being able to sit alone in a room, all I needed was a piece of paper and I could make anything happen. And I didn't have to even worry about a budget. Time was the only factor that I had to somehow buy myself time to be able to sit and do the work. I traveled again for a while and then eventually turned to writing prose more.
Cattle chores, one-ring circus.
As a writer, that's one of the biggest things you have to figure out is how to procure time. And so one short story I wrote while I was living in Italy was based on a small one-ring circus that I went and visited. It's all about finding characters, finding truths, and trying to render a world that sometimes is exotic and sometimes is extremely domestic and banal, but people's lives are dramatic. I do my screenwriting mostly because I enjoy the collaborative aspect of it. Prose writing, you sit alone in a room for days, hours, years. With screenwriting, what it enabled me to do is to collaborate. Not just ultimately in the film project, but in the actual writing of it. So those three films that you mentioned are all collaborations I've done with a friend I had met, a fellow student at NYU, Ed Radtke.
I'd like to watch a clip from one of the films that you've done, Speed of Life.
My brother always said that my dad would talk about Alaska, about how he would go up there first, and then one day he'd come back for me and my brother. really good job up there on a fishing boat. There's supposed to be a lot of fish up in Alaska. My dad, he never really liked the city. But everybody who visits, they always like it. But what's not to like when you're on vacation?
Don't come any closer. Hey! You freaks are gonna kill somebody!
I got a freak for you! Suck on this, freak!
Come down here, so I can break your other arm.
Right. Quit trying to bone my sister! You're old enough to be a daddy! Shut up, Dookie!
Don't make me come up there.
And get a job, cause you ain't moving in with us! I'm done with my community service. You know why? Because you ain't doing your goddamn community service. You hear what I'm saying? Hey, Chop Chop, have you been sucking big black dicks again? Is that it?
I'm on the phone. Do you mind?
Your mama sucked big black dick.
Hey, don't talk about my mom.
And your father sucked big black dick. You wish you had yourself a big black dick.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Come on, Chop Chop, buy me something. That one right there. So are you gonna buy me a cake? Are you gonna let me have it?
No,
You don't need to wait.
I wouldn't do that.
You know what the secret is of getting a big dick? Give me that cake, and I'll tell you. Your job is so whack, so easy. A monkey could do it. Come on with your whack job. How much do your job pay? I could buy some Chinese food with that. My friend told me you had a little dick.
1004. It's new season. 1005. My new starring role. 1006. 1007.
Come on, tell me.
1008. 1009. 1010.
Did you hear a word I said? Huh? Oh, my Lord.
So, where you from?
Latvia.
What do you speak?
Latvian.
That's a nice camera.
Yeah?
Yeah, I got that same camera. So who you with?
My family. Kačavia, how do you do?
I like to keep all the tapes like to see where everybody comes from, what they do on their holidays, where they get to go. I'm gonna see all of those places too. There's so much to see.
Are you done yet?
Here, you take it now. You're like an ice skater.
Ween,
That's green.
she's gonna be a great ice skater. She'll be in the Olympics someday, and she'll travel the world too. And we'll meet in faraway places.
You be careful in there. Just a few more days. Keep studying, reading that Bible. You got bigger things to be thinking about now. Some things will be good when you come out, but you got to walk the chalk line. No more drugs. I'm getting better every day. Just gotta be patient. Gotta go now. We think about you. We love you. Turn it off, Sam.
You always make it to see me, little brother.
That's because Grandma makes me.
You'd come anyway. And don't call her Grandma.
Why not?
Because she ain't a grandma, that's why. Remember, it's only you and me. We always gotta help each other.
I'm always helping you. You always say that. When are you gonna quit saying that? And I'm making space for everybody, so you can have the whole room.
How you gonna do that?
I got plans.
You still talking about that same bullshit?
Why do you always have to be such an asshole?
Because it's stupid. You sound stupid when you talk about that.
You're stupid.
Don't talk to me like that. All right, 3 days, that's cake. And then I'll take care of my own shit.
You swear?
I don't have to swear. I always speak the truth to you. Right?
You know what you're gonna say today? Because last time you were on forever.
She don't mind.
Call her Grandma. She likes it.
That was a really interesting segment from your film. You've talked about how this whole process of doing this film was completely collaborative. I'd like to invite in Ed Radtke, your director and co-writer. Hello, Ed, come on in. We can talk about the whole collaboration process.
Probably going back, we were students together at NYU, and that's where we met. And it became very clear to us very fast that we had very similar sensibilities and intentions, I think, and what kinds of movies we wanted to make. And we just became fast friends, and that's over 30 years ago. So we've had an ongoing friendship as well as creative collaboration. And I've helped Ed make, 3 films to date, Ed, and number 4's coming up next.
You wanted to make films about similar things. What kinds of things?
I mean, I think it was about drama, and it was about simple people facing things that were beyond their capacities.
But I would add that we responded and were drawn to themes of boys becoming men, of fathers, missing fathers, fragmented family, travel and the hero's journey. And we also weren't interested in villains or antagonists in the classical sense, but more about the struggle, the ordinary struggles of extraordinary people, or the extraordinary struggles of ordinary people.
So where did you find your stories?
For me, personally, they've come very much from the core of my own being and from my own experiences of growing up in the Midwest as a sort of an outcast and coming from a bit of a dysfunctional family. I don't know about many of you, but I came from one, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. And so the storytelling was in many ways a way of processing or working through some of that, and Mark and I really gravitated to those similar themes.
We mentioned the things about fathers and sons, and I think each of us had similar kinds of backgrounds where those were challenging dynamics.
So you decided on a story. Ed came to you and said, hey, Marc, here's the story that I'm thinking of.
Right.
And you wrote the story? How did
Yeah,
that happen?
well, we would sort of do it together. All of them ended up being, Ed, I would say, Ed's story and Ed, the primary storyteller, because he was going to direct it as well. He was going to be invested on it in that kind of level. So I always saw myself as serving Ed's tales. And that always made a very clear understanding between us, and ego never ended up coming into the play. It was, each of us would write scenes, segments, drafts, and then come back together to one another. Sometimes we would just talk out scenes over a pool table, play 8-ball, and just be talking characters, talking about what happens next. And the pool table was the first film we did together, which was Bottomland. And that one directly came out of a lot of Ed's life. Afterwards, life came along, and we ended up moving and living in different places, and it was sort of a treasure for us to get together for a weekend, and we would hole up in a room and, again, just talk things out.
One thing that comes to mind is the whole idea of two writers holed up in a room for a weekend sounds rather intense and perhaps bland, but Marc and I have a great deal of fun together, and specifically with the road movie that we made, Marc and I would take road trips, and we would sometimes spend weeks living out of a tent or a little Mazda, and we would journey through the country and follow the direction which our characters ultimately would. And it was an extraordinary experience and an adventure for us, but it was also this incredible opportunity to flesh out characters, to take note of extraordinary backdrops, locations that would also serve us as well as be just absolutely beautiful visually.
Do you keep the audience in mind? Are you writing to a particular audience?
We have consciously always been aware of the fact that our work and the characters that we often write about are not first and foremost high concept commercial. We don't really have that in mind when we're scribbling. We scribble freely and honestly, and then at some point, you take all those notes and images and lines or characters, and you try to make sense of them. And then, of course, you keep an audience in mind, because we're very, very conscious of the 3-act structure.
I think we probably pay more attention to the characters than we do the audience. I think if you're truthful to the characters, that will hopefully, read and render itself to the audience and their empathies and engagement with the story. In certain respects, directly thinking about audience, that almost doesn't even come into play almost to when you're editing it, right? After we've even shot, that's where a lot of that kind of thought comes in terms of, oh my God, this story we wrote that was only 120 pages is 2 hours long now that we've cut it. And in those senses, then the audience and thinking about rhythms and what they'll sit for, and that's where that comes into play. So when you're editing, or when Ed edits, or he has people edit for him, that's a whole nother revision of the story is going on at that stage.
So does it help to be screenwriting when you're a director? Does it bring a different quality to your writing?
I guess so. I don't know any other way. I mean, I've written for hire a few times, projects that I don't intend to direct, but I still, like any writer, I'm guessing, I still see very clearly the arc and the flow and the faces, even though a filmmaker who takes my material will cast it differently and stylistically approach it differently.
In the film Dreamcatcher, there was a time that we were just going into production on it, and the producers were like pulling their hair out saying, oh my God, this is too long, the script, we don't have the funds for this, you have to cut 10, 15 pages out of this more. And so Ed brought me in and said, okay, sit in a room and see what you can do. And in about a day and a half, I was able to cut out 10 pages. And I ran to Ed and I showed him in the segment, and he looked at it and he was like, well, this does work on the page. As far as storytelling, yeah, I can make that leap. But it was actually at a point in this film that was leading up to a major sort of almost climax of the film. And what I had cut out was all this stuff I figured out could happen off screen. And he was like, well, it can happen off screen, but it's not going to work in terms of the rhythm of the film. And he understood that more because he's the filmmaker and he's an editor as well, and a fine editor. So he could really see how it was like, this was a question of rhythm. It wasn't a question of structure, it was a question of rhythm, and those were different things.
As purely structuralists, there were elements of the narrative that we could have eliminated, but there's a humanity and an interconnectedness and a relationship arc, as well as a story arc. And some of the scenes, I think, that were being lobbied that we drop because of budget and time constraints weren't necessarily structurally significant, but they ultimately became the core of the story that we were telling, which is, do you care about these people?
Yeah.
Do you want to follow them for 90 minutes and find out what happens in the end? And for Mark and I, that became the core of what we do.
It took us a while to write, right, Ed?
Bad writing is hard. I mean, good writing is 10 times harder. And for me, at least, because we all also have to write in isolation, even if you're collaborating, there's a lot, most of the time you're not together writing. The ideas don't necessarily come uniformly, they don't come because you expect them, and oftentimes I would record images or words or take photographs or lines of dialogue or character sketches, and then I would bring all of that with me to see Mark, and we would hang out for, usually it was more than a weekend because we were a little younger and we had a certain flexibility to be able to just lay low and just feel trustful enough of our relationship that I could share those fragments. I mean, most writers can't share fragments with others for feedback because there's no real cohesion to them. And so you end up having to write something with a beginning, middle, and end before you can get feedback. But with Mark and I, we could do it in a way that was sort of unspoken and an intrinsic, innate understanding and trust that we had for each other. And that was actually probably one of the most learned lessons that I ever had, was being able to consider myself a writer and our ideas valid enough that we could take seriously the notion of developing them. And that is huge for writers.
Is there a different formula that also works as well when you've sort of branched out on your own and you've been working with other people?
I think there are numerous methods and ways of working that are productive, some more productive or more painful than others, but I think in the end, work gets done. But the relationship that I have with Mark as a collaborator is rare, and I don't see that very often in my own work, and I don't see it often with others. I've heard, we've all heard horror stories about how screenplays get written collectively.
So what are some of the horror stories?
Fist fights, if not legal battles. You always see various names on a given script, and it doesn't mean they all work together. It could very well be different iterations of the script that have come through. What we would do for the longest period of time is just talk out character. So we would talk about these people back and forth, and so would they do this? How would they react in this situation? So that ultimately we knew who they were and who they weren't. And it seemed to us that we needed to have it's not like just writing down a biography of who your character is. It's sort of being able to inhabit them, to be in their shoes and know how they might react given certain ethical choices or certain challenges to them. And so once we had a real feel for them, then the scenes would I won't say that they wrote themselves, but it was more about just saying, action and letting the characters start to move in the space with one another and other characters.
You have so many different characters. How do you inhabit them? How do you grow into them? How do you intuitively know how each character might respond?
Yeah, if we want to talk about something in the collaboration, Ed always has tons of characters, and I'm always trying to cut it back. I would have to say, to some extent, that's been a dynamic that has happened at times. I'm thinking, there's no way we could have that many characters. How can the story sustain that? And Ed says, it can. I see it. Believe me. Just trust me. And I think we've slowly moved away from, I mean, if you look at the progression of our stories, one of them was of a single family on a single plot of land, was the first one for Bottomland. Dream Cat involved two different characters from different backgrounds on the road through you know, dozens of states on a road trip. And then finally we recognized and that was in Dreamcatcher. In Speed of Light, we looked for the next challenge, which was how do we write a multiple narrative? How do we fit in? We had a character we had for way back, years and years ago, different films, different stories. We've always had this parole officer that we wanted to write. And he just didn't fit in any of the stories. And it was like, this story, he's fitting in on. And we sort of built it around him in a way.
Just commenting on Marc's note about my desire to try to incorporate additional characters into the narrative. I think one of the things I've learned, both as a filmmaker and as an educator, is that audiences have become very savvy, and they can handle a lot of story. And I love a narrative that's, well, I love good story, period. But I felt very strongly that with The Speed of Life, which is by far the most sophisticated narrative involving the most characters, I felt both stimulated and excited about doing something that was very unfamiliar to both of us, but also trusting the audience could follow it. And the other thing that you have to remember, and you know this as an editor as well, is that the key in editing is to have choices. And so it's unfortunate that we shoot scenes or fragments of scenes that end up on the cutting room floor, but it's really imperative most of the time the editing process becomes a rewriting process. You have that option in front of you. If you don't shoot the scene, you can never incorporate it. I don't necessarily have to live in each character's skin, but I tend to create characters, and I think Marc as well. I tend to create characters that I'm familiar with, or in real life there are people that I know or have come into contact with, and they leave such an indelible impression or such an influence on my life that somehow they haunt me, and they become a part of this box, this cardboard box of characters that I want to explore and live with, because as a screenwriter, I certainly end up living with these make-believe characters, and Marc and I, we would talk about them for sometimes years as real, living, breathing people.
You know, you don't have to, you know, just because I am not a woman from the 16th century, or I don't live in an inner city ghetto, what's common is our humanity and our emotions. And so as long as you can touch into what it means to struggle with the basic human condition, you can empathize with any character. I mean, I'm not of the belief that you can only write what you quote unquote know. I think you use what you do know to write about what you don't. The one thing I think that is true within filmmaking is that, and in screenwriting, is that, you know, your thing is not a finished product. It's not like when I'm writing a book. I'm writing a blueprint which someone else is then going to take into another form. So you are required ultimately to collaborate no matter what, even if you're writing the script on your own. The way to think about that is not to consider yourself in a vacuum. You need to get involved and find other people that have similar passions as you and just start talking with them. Make yourself available to other storytellers and other filmmakers in town.
A fascinating conversation.
Thanks a ton, buddy.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Marc, and thank you for watching Indie Film Forum. I'm Kalpana Biswas. See you again next time. For more information on Marc Nieson and Indie Film Forum, please visit our websites. Coming up.